with the Mexican-American War at the end of last semester. We're picking back up the election of 1848. The California Gold Rush is in full effect. Migration westward has moved from Oregon and diverted down further south towards California. Remember, the person in the White House is James K. Polk. Polk is going to be a one-term president, not because he lost a re-election. In fact, Polk, as far as accomplishments go, had some pretty major accomplishments. But another thing he had was major explosive diarrhea. If you look at chapter 18, this guy, I don't know if he could just not get off the pot or what, but the presidency did not agree with him. He had stomach issues, he had stress issues. He made it known that he was only in it for 4 years and then he was getting out. So we have an election in 1848. This is going to be one of the last times that we see the Whig Party. It's going to be one of the last times before the end of the Civil War that we see two national parties. What I mean is that the candidates represent parties that exist in both parts of the country, North and South. During the Civil War, or during the next couple of elections leading up to the Civil War, we're going to have sectional parties. The Republican Party is a sectional party. When Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, he is not on any of the ballots in the South. None. And he still wins. That really, in a nutshell, is an example of what the South was most afraid of, that they would lose influence at the national level. Okay, so it's not necessarily just about the abolition of slavery. There's not anyone winning a major election that is supportive of complete abolition. We'll talk about the Free Soil Party today. The Free Soilers weren't race friendly. They weren't about black legal equality. They were about the protection of white interests. And they were just as racist as their Southern counterparts. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, a lot of this debate over the expansion of slavery boils down to a sense of control at the national level. Keep that in mind, all right? So we've got two political parties during this time. Number one are the Democrats. Okay, the candidate for the Democrats is General Cass. And you will never hear that name again in all of your history books or history lessons. I don't hardly recognize that name. But the reason we need to know General Cass and his platform as a Democrat. Remember, the Democrats, who's the big president that really established the Democratic Party? He's on the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson. Okay? His platform on the slavery issue is that the issue of slavery should be decided based on popular sovereignty. Okay? While you'll never hear of General Cass again, be sure you commit the term popular sovereignty to your heart, your mind, your body, and your spirit, because it falls in line with Jacksonian democracy. Popular. The word popular means to do what the majority of people want done. Sovereignty means the power to rule. So the will of the people should rule in popular sovereignty. So that's what the Democratic candidate was supporting, this idea that in the new territories, Utah and New Mexico, popular sovereignty should decide the slavery issue. Not everybody that supported popular sovereignty supported slavery. In fact, there were a lot of people that believed slavery would die out, that the people of a state would recognize whether they needed slaves or not, and most new territories would be settled by free soilers who didn't want to compete with slavery, and they might get rid of slavery on their own. The threat is, though, that it might spread slavery. You know, the Southerners are eager to add more territory. We're going to see times where Southerners and Northerners are sending basically recruits to a new territory to try to cast votes and swing the state in one direction or another. Kansas, you guys learned a little bit about Bleeding Kansas, it sounds like, in middle school. People from Missouri were illegally crossing state lines to cast votes to try to influence the election. And this leads to bloodshed, okay? But Popular sovereignty wasn't in and of itself supportive of slavery. It was supportive of the rights for people to decide any issues. So that's what the Democratic candidate stood for. On the other side of the aisle is Zachary Taylor, general during the Mexican-American War, considered the hero of Buena Vista. This is what I love. Check that picture out. I can't imagine any time in our current history where we would elect some overweight, sloppily dressed president with bad hair. I can't imagine that. You know, image is so important now that we'd never elect somebody that looks as sloppy as Zach Taylor. Anyway, Zach Taylor is a Whig, and this is what I'll remember about the Whigs. Okay, Henry Clay was a Whig. Whigs are big on compromise. The Whigs exist both in the North and the South. But I think if they had a mascot, it would have to be the jellyfish. It seems every time a Whig runs for president, we hear this story about how they wouldn't commit to something. And if you know a jellyfish, figuratively, is somebody without a backbone, right? And so Zach Taylor doesn't want to take a position on the slavery issue. He kind of is wishy-washy, goes where the current blows him. Here's how he wins then. Populism. He's a war hero, right? People recognize his name. It's not about what he stands for, it's about who he is. We've seen a lot of populist presidents, especially in our own time, people that have a name that's recognizable. They have a media presence, and it's not so important what they stand for. But I'll tell you this, I hope someday when I run for president, my campaign posters have me mounted on a hill of my enemy's skulls. Okay? That would be pretty cool, like 8-push student skulls or something like that. There's Zach Taylor, and this is a pro-Taylor cartoon, demonstrating how he got to the top, killing Mexicans in the Mexican-American War. A third political party enters the race in 1848. So we've got the Democrats, we've got the Whigs, and the Whigs are going to pretty much dissolve after this election. The third party is the Free Soil Party. And as you know, with third parties, they're not going to be able to elect a major candidate, but they are going to swing or influence the outcome. So the Free Soilers pick Martin Van Buren. Yes, the same Martin Van Buren that was president after Andrew Jackson. I guess they couldn't find a better candidate, but they drag out old MVB to be their candidate. And what they stand for is a mix of Western and Northern interests. Okay? Just like the Whigs, they support internal improvements. You remember Henry Clay and the American system? Old Henry Clay is going to make his exit in this speech today. Okay? But they stand for internal improvement projects. They stand for the bank, and they stand for protective tariffs. What region of the country supports a strong tariff? The North, right? Northerners. Can you see how this is becoming a sectional issue? The Free Soilers came from urban areas in the North and wanted to defend American manufacturing. But they also came from the West, and they supported homestead acts that would give cheap, small plots of land to people moving into the West. So we got a kind of a mix of Democratic and Whig ideas here in the Free Soil Party. The Free Soilers are going to be the advent or the herald of the Republican Party. As we saw with the Federalists had to collapse before the Whigs could evolve. The Whigs are going to collapse, and the Republicans are going to fill the void. The Republicans are never going to be a real third party. Instead, we get Northern Democrats and Southern Whigs and Free Soilers and Know-Nothings, and all of these people who don't have a home end up adopting this idea of Republican Party, okay? But the big thing that the Free Soil Party stands for, it gives them their name, is this opposition to slavery. Opposition to slavery, not because they were race-friendly and believed in black equality, quite the opposite. Free soilers could be just as racist and bigoted as their southern neighbors. What they wanted to do was to protect the interests of white men. They wanted to protect free labor. And remember how when the idea of free labor first came up, there were some of you that thought, oh, free labor, that means slave labor, because it's free. That's wrong. Free labor means you own your own labor, capitalism, right? You can work for wages. You can do what you want to do. You can live the American dream like Thomas Jefferson preached as a small farmer who moves himself up the social ladder and becomes a good citizen. That's what free labor is. The Free Soilers wanted to protect that idea in the West, okay? They weren't looking for black competition and they weren't looking for black neighbors, okay? The second scariest thing next to slavery to many white people was this idea that emancipated slaves would then, what? Live in the same society with them? That was not anything most white people were willing to accept. So Free Soilers opposed slavery and its expansion into the new territory. Okay, there's this sort of myth that the South was afraid of abolition, okay, or that abolition was threatening the South, and that's not true. No one in a major political office was supporting abolition of slavery. The South was healthy, its economy was growing, the cotton market was strong, slavery was growing steadfastly. The real threat here to the South is the sectional balance. Like I said, when Abraham Lincoln gets elected, it's without any votes from the South. And the fear is if the North gains an advantage in Washington, they will disregard the interests of the South and things like abolition could take place. Okay? So the big fear is that the South is deeply worried that the balance in Congress is going to tip permanently in favor of the North. Why would they feel that way? Because the state the territory that's knocking on the door for statehood is California. California at any time, especially because of the gold rush, is going to become a state. Both sides have been working to try to make it fit their own agenda. There was a big wave of pro-slavery people that settled in California and worked in the California government. But it looks like it's going in the direction of being a free state, okay? There's no more territory under the Missouri Compromise for slavery to expand. Texas was it, right? The old Missouri Compromise map had no other room for the expansion of slavery. Some people say, oh, well, we should run that line all the way to the Pacific coast. But that isn't appeasing to Southerners, and it frankly concerns Northerners too, especially those that don't want to see any slavery. So what do we do about that? Another big thing that was concerning to Southerners is agitation, abolition agitation in our nation's capital. Yesterday, we saw a picture of William Lloyd Garrison, right? The guy who authors The Liberator. We've seen Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is a very vocal abolitionist at this time, going to Washington, D.C. and lobbying Congress. We've heard stories about Nat Turner and other kinds of slave rebellions that are taking place where Old Massa gets his head chopped off. We hear about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad and the fear that slaves in countless numbers are being shipped and ferried up to the north and to Canada for their freedom. And so the South is not only angry, but fearful of this effort to take away their style of life, to subvert it. And what I mean by subversion is to illegally undermine the South. There is a fugitive slave law in place in the United States, and nobody seems to be enforcing it. Now, this fear and paranoia is a bit embellished, okay? Harriet Tubman, for as heroic as she is, as interesting as those stories are, that's why we tell elementary kids the story of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Only about 1,000 African Americans were being saved in that approach per year. will you ever be able to emancipate America's 3 million slaves, taking them out 1,000 at a time? No. Okay? Most slaves, and this is or most former slaves, this goes in line with one of the questions that you have on your study guide. Most slaves found their freedom either by purchasing their own freedom or by being emancipated by empathetic slave owners or people that got out of the slave business. So, more people gained their freedom through voluntary emancipation or self-purchase than any other means. That accounts for why there's a large and growing free black population in the United States. Okay? But look at this. A lot of people aren't good with geography and don't appreciate that Washington, D.C. is a southern state. Here's Washington, D.C. You can see a northern border of Virginia. The straight line here, the southern border of Pennsylvania, is called the Mason-Dixon line. That's freedom. That's where free territory starts. You have to go through Maryland to get there. Okay? Washington, D.C. is deep in the South. That was part of the compromise to get the Constitution passed, if you remember. Federalists compromised with anti-federalists, put the capital in the South, on a swamp, along the Potomac River. If D.C. becomes an oasis of abolitionism, the fear is that slaves will go there, get their freedom, and be able to travel wherever they want to be. Underground Railroad passage, similar to what you would find with with Harriet Tubman. Here's Harriet Tubman in this photograph. I love the fact that we're now looking at photographs. You saw Zach Taylor, and it's obviously photography and video will also change the way that politicians look and act. But we are now in the advent of the photograph. And so history, I think, becomes more meaningful when we can start to look at pictures. But you'll notice people are blurry. Early photographs took 20, 30 minutes to develop. So you had to stand still or it'd get blurred. This is why a lot of people in old photographs aren't smiling. You don't want to hold a big cheesy smile for 30 minutes. The other reason is that portraiture, having a painting drawn of or created of someone, portraits were done by the affluent. And the affluent wanted to look prestigious. And to have a big cheesy smile on your face made you look like you were a little daft. And so portraiture, people would have a serious look. So early photographs, people kind of reflect that culture. It won't be until the creation of the Kodak instant camera that people start to smile, because now film is cheap and anybody can get it. And they want to take pictures of kids and kids can't stop smiling. But that's not going to be until the early 1900s, okay, the beginning of the 20th century. So the fear of the Underground Railroad, the fear of slave rebellions is what leads to harsher conditions and a demand for a fugitive slave law, okay? It's propaganda on both sides. Abolitionists are pointing to the work of Tubman and saying, look at this heroic act, we need to do stuff like this. Look at the threat slavery poses to individuals. On the other hand, South is pointing to it and saying, look at how the North is subverting our way of life and encouraging these violent and dangerous and illegal actions. (1850) is going to be the time of action. Okay? Why? California wants statehood in 1850. So action has to be taken. You can no longer ignore the problem. California wants in as a free state. The South is not going to allow that to happen without some serious compromise. Now, I want to say a minute here. One of the terms you need to be familiar with is old and new guard. So the old guard, guys like Henry Clay, who is always insistent on compromise, they're in their 80s and 90s, and they remember the birth of the nation. Okay, and they've always believed compromise was the best approach to saving the Union. They want the Union above everything else, which I would point out makes Abraham Lincoln, whose concern is about union, a pretty conservative person. Okay? As opposed to the old guard, we have the new guard. We have fire eaters in the South, people that were insistent it's going to either be the expansion of slavery or secession. In 1850, there's a convention to be held in Nashville, Tennessee, to propose the secession of the South. Now, the compromises of 1850 are going to beat that convention to the punch and calm things down a bit. But fire eaters were not interested in compromise. Neither were Northern New Guards. The New Guard wanted ideological purity, this idea that we need to get rid of slavery in the new territories. No compromise. Okay? When we get to that situation where two sides are backed in their corners and compromise is impossible, we start to look at civil war. That makes me worry about our nation today. It seems like very few people are willing to sit down and compromise. Fortunately, there was good congressional leadership during this time. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster eased this tension for the moment. Okay, let's look at each of them in their turn. You've had enough exposure to Henry Clay. You know he's all about compromise. And this is his finest hour as far as people of his generation are concerned. He encourages leaders from both sections to come to the table and make concessions. Now, be sure you understand the difference between concession, secession, session, right? Succeed, concede. A lot of funny little words in there. But to concede something or make concessions isn't to make popcorn at a basketball game. Concession is to give someone something they want, okay? Despite what it costs you. So Clay encourages concession on both sides. Look at this image here. Clay making his final speech to Congress. He will not live long after this. You can see everybody listening intently. It's going to be several hours long, talking about the future, the fate of the Union. And up here in this chair, this is the Senate president or the head of the Senate, who is the vice president. That's Millard Fillmore. I'm going to talk about old Millard Fillmore here in a second, one of the forgotten presidents, okay? But you can see he's intently listening, and it's going to be Millard Fillmore that signs the Compromise of 1850 into law. Well, what happens to old Zach Taylor? I'll tell you. Zach Taylor, in the middle of summer, goes to a party, a picnic. He is served strawberries on chilled ice, on chilled milk, okay? Now these strawberries and milk had been sitting out in the July sun for who knows how long, and he develops a really bad stomach bug and expires from it after a couple of weeks. Some historians think it was cholera or a bacteria that grows in water and bad water. At any rate, he dies of a really bad tummy ache, okay? Probably the best thing he did for our nation, or the most significant thing that Zach Taylor did for our nation, was die so that Millard Fillmore could sign the Compromise of 1850 into law. Well, what was this compromise and who did it come from? The South's demands were articulated by John C. My Bad Hair Calhoun. I love this hair, right? How about that? I'm working on it. John C. Calhoun can barely speak. He has tuberculosis, and he's had surgery on his neck. He wears some pictures of him, you'll see him, he looks really, really sick. He's got this thing on his neck covering it up. He can barely speak. And again, this guy's a ball of rage. And when he speaks, he gets tongue-tied, spits blood. But in his final moments, he's talking about what the South demands. The South demands access to expansion. The South demands stronger fugitive slave laws. If they can't have those things, they will secede, and they will secede peacefully. If they can't secede peacefully, they are ready for a fight. Okay? He proposes as compromise 2 presidents, one from each section of the country. One from the north, one for the south, that have the veto power, but he believes that would save the Union. But he's that convinced that the South is ready to walk. As I said, the balance is 15-15. Someone has to go across the aisle and extend the olive branch. Well, who's it going to be? It's going to be this guy here, Daniel Webster. Okay, Webster is a Whig. As you know, Whigs, like John C. Calhoun, always kind of pushing for compromise, willing to preserve the Union above everything else. Abraham Lincoln at this time is a Whig. Just making those connections, because we're going to see Lincoln do a lot of things you're not expecting him to do, having been taught that he's the great emancipator. Okay? Daniel Webster gives this big speech in which he encourages Northerners to support a fugitive slave law and popular sovereignty in the new territories. Even though he personally is against slavery, his big concern, kind of a dog whistle here. You know, dog whistles you can't hear. Dogs can hear them, but you can't. His big push is that, look, civil war would be catastrophic to the Northern economy. Civil war would destroy American manufacturing. Okay? No one wants war. No one wants secession. So we need to do what the South needs us to do. Okay? Free soilers and abolitionists almost want to crucify this guy, which is why we get images like this. You should have looked at this yesterday as part of your homework. What's your take of Daniel Webster in this particular image? He's getting owned. I don't want to use... You said it and not me. He is getting owned here by slave interests. They're literally riding him around. And so he looks foolish, he looks weak. And if you notice all the mayhem that's going on around him, the one hero of this image is William Lloyd Garrison, the radical abolitionist. So very strong criticism of Daniel Webster in this picture. The people that wanted to crucify Webster were guys like this, William Seward, the Young Guard, as I mentioned. What we're starting to see are people criticizing slavery on moral grounds. I don't know if any of you have ever been criticized as being bad, evil, more immoral. But that really stings for the South. Okay, first of all, it's this assumption of superiority, that the North in its values are more Christian, more civilized, doing the right thing, and by implication, the South is doing the wrong thing. So he amps up the rhetoric. Seward says that Christian legislators need to obey God's laws above man's laws. And actually, this is going to cost him a future bid for the presidency. Lincoln is going to beat Seward, but then he makes Seward his Secretary of State, which is pretty cool, right? Seward is going to be kind of the moral conscience of Abraham Lincoln, and he's going to be the liaison for Lincoln to Congress as the 13th Amendment goes through the legislative process to emancipate slaves. How about this for a look, a presidential look? Zach Taylor dies in 1850, so Millard Fillmore, look at that. Can't imagine a president with hair like that. Takes the reins and passes the Compromise of 1850. Okay? One of the forgotten presidents. With the passage of the Compromise of 1850, we have kind of a new era of good feelings. It stops this talk about secession, at least for another decade. It buys the North time to grow. And so I guess we need to now, with our final conclusion, look at who got the better deal, the North or the South, and what were the big consequences of this particular agreement. Okay. Who got the better deal, the North or the South? Well, the South got a lot. Okay, the whole compromise was trying to bring the South to the table so that California could come in as a free state. But the North is going to win, and here's why. Even though the North, their bag has fewer items in it, it has the most important one, and that's that California is going to tip congressional power in favor of the North. And it's not going to change. Now, the South has potential to grow. The second important part of the Missouri Compromise is that new territory will decide the slavery issue based on popular sovereignty. New Mexico and Utah are technically open to slavery if they vote on it. So look at this map. Orange is the South, blue is the North, and in red here we have the area that could potentially adopt slavery based on popular sovereignty. Now that's still not a lot of room. And in a minute here, I'm going to talk about one of the plans Southerners have in order to expand America in support of slavery. And that is to take over territory in Latin America. Okay? But let's look at what the South won in this compromise. So, number one, the chance to expand through popular sovereignty. Number two, it stopped the abolition drive in Washington, D.C. Now, they had to give a little bit. Okay, so Washington, D.C. was allowed to prohibit the slave trade. But slavery was still permitted in Washington, D.C. And I want to point out something that I find very symbolic and also highly ironic. You guys have all seen the Capitol building, right? The dome. On top of the dome is the Statue of Freedom. That Capitol dome was built during this time by the hands of black slaves. So the Capitol building, which is the greatest symbol of American democracy and American liberty, with the Statue of Freedom on top, is literally built by people who had none of those things. Okay, at a time where the debate over slavery is raging on. So when you see that next time, I want you to remember that the Capitol of the United States was built with the blood, sweat, and tears of African slaves while the raging debate of slavery took place. Okay, so the trade is abolished, but the practice of slavery is still permitted in Washington, D.C. But here's the big feather in the South's cap: the adoption of the Fugitive Slave Laws. Okay, the Fugitive Slave Laws, you're going to need to make sure you understand what kinds of things the Fugitive Slave Laws put in place. Number one, it would give consequences to people that helped harbor slaves and help them escape. Okay, so the Underground Railroad, it put federal punishments in place for abolitionists that participated in that. Number two, it allowed for bounty hunters to go into the North, into territories that had eliminated slavery, and to get slaves or get black people and drag them back to the South. It created this commission to oversee this whole process. But here's the thing: the commissioners on this court, they got paid $5 if they allowed a slave to stay free. They got paid $10 if they found that the black person was a slave and sent back to their owners. So can you imagine how they typically treated these cases? Okay, twice as much money in it for the commissioners if they found a black person was indeed a slave. Solomon Northrop writes a diary. This guy was a tailor living in the North. He's scooped up off the streets by a bounty hunter and sold into slavery. Born a free black man, and is sent into slavery for a dozen years. This is the basis for the story 12 Years a Slave, which we'll be looking at a little bit. Okay. The North doesn't take it lying down. Instead, they take and pass laws that make it difficult for bounty hunters to do their work. Some states refuse to allow bounty hunters to use local jails to house runaway slaves. Some of them pass laws that allow law enforcement to refer to their own personal conscience and not participate in slave hunts. Okay. The South is going to continue to look for territory to expand slavery. I know we only have 5 minutes remaining here, but I need to get through this, okay? They turn their attention, the Southern leaders turn their attention to Latin America. We're going to see some Southerners put together militias and actually go to Baja California, the peninsula south of California, Tijuana is there, and they actually lead a revolt against the local government, set up shop there, and take control of it. And the United States starts to have diplomatic relations with this group of rebels, thinking maybe we could create a new state, when Mexico and Nicaragua and some Latin American states come and retaliate, kill or capture the governor, hold him trial, execute him by firing squad. At that point, the United States is like, you know what? We're not interested in another conflict with Mexico. Okay. The president that's responsible for this is Franklin Pierce. Another one of these forgettable presidents, except for the fact like Millard Fillmore and Zachary Taylor, he's got greasy, straggly hair. People haven't realized that I guess a camera is going to capture your image forever. But Franklin Pierce, again, kind of a Southern sympathizer, Democrat, is going to look into purchasing Cuba. Okay? I'm really kind of shortening up this lesson on Cuba, but Southerners were highly interested in purchasing Cuba all the way back to James K. Polk. Polk had offered $100,000 for the purchase of Cuba. Spain rejected that. Pierce puts together a commission to investigate purchasing Cuba, and that commission meets in Ostend, Belgium. And they put together a letter recommending to President Pierce that he offer $120 million for Cuba. This memo is leaked by abolitionist newspapers, and the North goes wild. Okay? There is no way the North is going to support the expansion of slavery and the purchase of territory. Now, we will find ourselves back in Cuba at war with Spain in another 40 years. Okay, but for the time being, the issue of sectional territorial expansion is put on ice. Here's my last thought. Okay, the bigger impact of the Missouri Compromise is this. The hard line the South took on the Fugitive Slave Law ultimately works against them. It wakes up a sleeping giant in the North. It amps up abolitionism. It makes people who were sort of on the fence about abolitionism, it really upsets Northerners, because all of a sudden Southerners are able to come up into their territory, violate their local laws, and carry out what they see as injustice. So it wakes up the sleeping giant of Northern abolitionism. Another thing is, compromise is going to delay civil war. That means 10 more years of the North building its economic superiority, 10 more years of the North building its population superiority, 10 more years of the North expanding railroads and telegraph lines. The instruments of war are going to grow in that decade that give the North the advantage over the South. So if Civil War had broken out as a result of the Nashville Convention, maybe it would have been a shorter war. But instead, the festering wound simmers for another 10 years and actually works to the North's advantage. Your book argues the Compromise of 1850 won the Civil War for the Union. I'm going to leave you with this map.